I think we're moving somewhere very fast, and we can see that a lot of industries will be turned upside down, and it's going to happen much quicker than it has happened before. The pace of change is increasing.
A warm welcome to AI Insights, Tomorrow's Tech Today, where we explore the frontiers of general artificial intelligence and discover the future of technology through engaging conversations and interviews tailored for AI enthusiasts and professionals alike. I'm your host, Tommy Siebenhühner, and I'm very excited to announce today's guest, Jim Dowling, or to be more precise, Dr. Jim Dowling, who is CEO of Hopsworks and Associate Professor at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. He is a co-inventor of the open source Hopsworks feature store platform, which we will talk about more in detail in a few minutes. And Jim is also currently writing a book on building machine learning systems for O'Reilly. Great to have you on the show, Jim.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for inviting me. Delighted to be here.
Very happy to. Jim, AI, respectively, generative AI has been the buzzword of 2023. And I'm pretty sure it'll be more than just a buzz, but rather a whole new symphony that is just being created right now. Where do you think is AI taking us, and how can businesses adapt to the immensely fast-paced change that is happening right now?
Yeah, it was a watershed year. I mean, I remember back in 2012 when deep learning came out, and it took like 4, 5, 6 years until people really saw it in their Facebook. They saw images being tagged and wondered, what is this magic? But generative AI has really come, barnstorming in, and within 1 year, you have tens of millions of students using it to write their essays. You have people using it to draft legal letters, avoid paying fees to lawyers. It's really changing business already. So I think we're moving somewhere very fast, and we can see that a lot of industries will be turned upside down, and it's going to happen much quicker than it has happened before. The pace of change is increasing. So I think for businesses, which was part of your question, how will businesses adapt? It depends on your industry, of course. So if you're working in an industry, and I will give an example of the legal industry, where a lot of the work is very, grunge work. You may have documents to fill in and checklists where people have, filled in everything correctly. A lot of that work will be able to be automated, and that will mean that opportunities for people who are doing the automation and challenges for people who will be automated out of jobs. So it's going to change a lot of industries, and it's going to happen fast. I think that's the main thing to take out of it.
Yeah, I do agree with you, absolutely. Then what is the role of Hopsworks playing in the AI revolution, that we're talking about? And what exactly is the feature store?
Yeah, so Hopsworks, we're a startup we were founded in Stockholm. We're a spin-off from KTH, but also we have people from MySQL. I used to work at MySQL. They're the largest deployed database in the world. So we're a data company. So what we do is we manage data for AI. So if you think of, you've heard cliches like data is the new oil and so on. I mean, we've heard this, right? But it's true that managing data is a tough problem. So, when you go in and try out machine learning or AI and you do a course, all the data is given to you nice and formatted and correct, and you just use it, and you're learning how to then work with the data to create something like an AI model. So your skills that you're acquiring are, I'm going to train or create this AI model, and then I'm going to use it. But in fact, the cliche in our world is that 90% of the work is getting that data into the state in which it can be used to create these models, we call training, but also to make predictions. And that's what we do as a company. We manage the data from where it is. It could be in your existing enterprise, or it could be on APIs, it could be anywhere out in the internet. And we need to bring that data together in a single place where the people who want to work with that data, what we call data scientists, can create these models, but also the applications that want to generate value. So it's one thing to train a model, but training a model once doesn't help create value. You need to have the model connected to the data to make predictions. So I normally say that if you train a model that makes one prediction, then it's generated value only once. So you want to have models that keep making predictions, generating more value for enterprises. And that's what Hopsworks does as a platform. It's called Hopsworks was in fact the first open source feature store for machine learning, also the first enterprise for serverless. We've done a lot of firsts in this space. We've been a category creator in the space of data platforms for machine learning. I use the term machine learning, but AI, it's really, they're interchangeable. So the cool kids 4 years ago only talked about machine learning, but in the post ChatGPT era, we're now able to say AI and not be embarrassed because we're moving in that direction towards
Mhm.
actual artificial intelligence. But so the feature store is a platform for managing all of this data. So if you take, for example, somebody who has heard about these new large language models like ChatGPT. Let's say you're a company and you've heard that OpenAI have this very good model, but you don't want to send your data there. You say, okay, I don't want to send my data to OpenAI for whatever reason. Maybe you have there's a legal reason why the data can't be sent, maybe for privacy. But you're still very interested in playing with these. So what you could use our platform for is managing your private data that you've collected to what we call fine tune an existing one of these open source large language models. So you may have heard of a company in France. There's a company called Mistral. There's one that's 7 billion, another one that's 48 billion parameters in size. But you can take those models, which are very good, and you can take your private data and you can fine tune the model to talk the language and understand your private data, because GPT doesn't know about your private data. Mistral, all these open source large language models do not know about your private data. But if you want the model to speak about your private data, to understand your private data and answer questions about your private data, then you'll need to do something like what we call fine tuning. And another technique is to take that data and augment your model with it. It's called retrieval augmented generation, or what people call as RAG. So our platform enables both of those things. You can take your private data and make your large language models personalized and know about your private data. So that's kind of one of the ways in which we add value in this space.
Obviously, in the field of private data, security is a topic, right? So,
Right.
so how do you ensure that private data remains private?
Yeah, of course. I mean, like I mentioned before, the cloud has been revolutionary in terms of enabling us to go faster, move faster, deploy applications faster, analyze our data faster. But many industries have been very careful about moving to the cloud because maybe they have legislative reasons why they can't, compliance reasons why they can't. And many organizations are frankly a little bit worried that if I send all my data to OpenAI, that maybe they'll just use, because their terms of service say that they can use this data to train models and so on, but then you might lose your competitive advantage. So private data is still very important for competitive advantage, but also for compliance. So they're the kind of two pillars it stands on, I guess.
Okay. Talking about security, as is so often the case with new technologies, the changes are also attracting the attention of legislators, right?
Yeah.
One result, very, I think, prominent result right now, is the European AI Act. What do you think of the act, and what impact will it have on the AI development in Europe?
Yeah, my take is it's a good thing, right? And I know that's not a popular opinion in our space. Often we've created a culture in IT that we say, "Oh, don't regulate us; we'll do good," and so on. And we've seen in social media that that isn't always the case, right? Like that what we tend to happen in our space is we tend to have monopolies tend to form. If it's mobile phones, it's Apple and Android. If it's operating systems, it's Windows and Apple and maybe Linux. So we tend to have these monopolies. So I think people are a little bit concerned that we'll have similar monopolies developing in terms of the large language models. We'll have OpenAI, and then you might have Google, and that is a challenge, particularly for not just for Europe, but globally. That if we're going to be reliant on one, two, three companies generating large language models, and everybody else who wants to avail of this technology having to use them and pay rent for using them, that becomes very challenging for the rest of the world. And I think we're seeing a very large movement towards open source in AI in the last 10 years. It's been phenomenal. Really, if you compare it with other industries, the advances people are making, they're telling everyone about them. They're sharing them. There's no patents anymore. And we're sharing also the models that are being trained. So Meta, if you've seen recently, they committed to releasing a new version of their open source model called Llama 3 this year in 2024. And it's going to be really good. It'll be competitive with what we've seen. So the the European AI Act has kind of been looking at how do we regulate, particularly the very large models that are being widely used, but also ensure that there'll be some sort of competition for the smaller models. And of course, this has led to a lot of uproar. So you can imagine that the very well funded companies who are very well positioned to capture a lot of this have been trying to influence the debate and saying, oh, this is terrible, they're regulating us, this is awful. But what it's also doing is enabling smaller open source models to compete on a more level playing field. So I'm in favor of that. I think also in Europe we have traditionally cared more about privacy and our data, ownership of our data, and that hasn't necessarily been reflected in other jurisdictions like the US. So I think that moving towards having some level of regulation, at least for the models that are the very largest models, and then helping the open source models kind of helping that ecosystem is just a good thing.
So, Jim, you've just been to the US, right? What is your take on the impact for the US, where most of the current big players within the AI universe are actually located?
Sure. So normally when anything happens in Europe, people in America just don't care. They're like not interested. Like, I mean, they're like, "Oh, Europe, you're useless. Your tech is useless. Everything is." Really, they have very low opinion of our IT sector, to be brutally honest.
Yeah.
And the only reason they care about this act is because there is an element of a threat in there, like to their dominance of this new technology. So the threat to having monopolies that are formed there is, and I think, I think their opinion is generally negative towards any regulation, and that's pretty. I think it's not just it's the US. I think in general in IT there's a culture of don't regulate us, we're good actors, we'll take care of everything. But I think like generally what we saw previously in the cloud was that Europe never really got to the races, so we don't have any cloud. Now we've AI. China, however, regulated themselves to a massive cloud industry with Alibaba and WeChat and Huawei and so on. And Europe has nothing. Europe are kind of thinking, okay, well, maybe we need to help our startups, whether it's Mistral or Hopsworks or whoever, to get off the ground, to give them some space in which they can compete before OpenAI comes in and takes all the market.
Is it enabling or rather maybe disabling, startups such as Hopsworks, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, look, any regulation you can always argue disables because it creates a burden. Now, the current version of the regulation, and it hasn't been passed completely yet, let's not get ahead of ourselves, was that the largest models will need to undergo some form of regulation, whereas smaller open source models will need self-regulation, which in effect means no regulation. So obviously that creates a burden for the very largest ones, but no burden for the smaller actors like ourselves, for example. So I think in that sense, it's trying to level the playing field somewhat. But there's always this massive capital imbalance. I don't know if you read Jeffrey Hinton wrote that he thought the first model this year would be trained that would cost $1 billion, $1,000 million. Now that's a massive capital investment that obviously startups can't do. And there's a question mark, which is, well, if you invest that amount and your large language model performs that much better, then it doesn't matter about these small regulations if the model is going to be that much better. But what we don't know at the moment is, will that investment in larger models lead to what we've seen so far, which is we've seen a very predictable increase in performance of these models as we make them larger and train them with more data. But at some point that will level off. We haven't seen it level off yet, but at some point it will. And the question is, will the next $1 billion give the same return on investment that the previous 100 million gave? That's a very interesting question. I don't know anyone knows the answer to it yet.
Okay, yeah. So we scratched a little bit, the topic of data and data sources in terms of, where does it come from? Right now, I believe that most of the AI tools are working with public data, right? It's an interesting case as we're probably moving further and further to more private data or even confidential data, right?
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen there? If we're going to have a move towards private data and confidential data.
Yeah, I think it's all up in the air right now. I don't know if you know that the New York Times are currently suing OpenAI about the data in their models. So we can say that ChatGPT is trained on public data, but the copyright of the data it's trained on, they don't necessarily own it or have access to it. So and there's this huge asymmetry, right? So if you use ChatGPT and it generates predictions, the terms and conditions are that you're not allowed to use those predictions to train your own model. But they've used the public data that they don't have copyright for to train their models. And so I think what we've seen, if we go back, let's say like 10 years, when Uber and a lot of these new startups came in, Airbnb, and just ignored regulations. They just said, okay, we don't care what your local regulations are. We're going to introduce a service and people are going to like it. And then they're going to go to their politicians and say, I want this service. Please change rules to allow me to keep Uber or Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
I think OpenAI are trying to follow the same go-to-market philosophy, which is, look, let's just get the service out there. People like using it. New York Times can have their lawsuit. You're not going to be able to close this can of worms. You've already opened it. Everyone's using it. That's not going to go back. So if we assume that's the case and that they'll lose to the New York Times, New York Times will lose, and OpenAI keep going, the next kind of case will be, okay, the first, I don't know, 20 trillion characters of text on the internet was produced by humans. How much of the next 50 trillion characters will be produced by large language models or by humans? And if it's produced, a large amount is produced by large language models, that's such as ChatGPT, and they say, hey, we produced it, we own it, you're not allowed to use that to train anymore, then we get into these kind of, you can say it as, in their case, it's what they would call a virtuous cycle, a positive feedback cycle, where they own all the data on the internet, and then they train their models on the data they own, and they say, we're not sharing this. So we get into some very interesting cases, and I think that's part of why the EUA Act is around, is to say, okay, let's kind of level the playing field a little bit before we get into that kind of scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of the other one is private data, I think businesses should be thinking about, what private data do I have that gives me a competitive advantage? Do I have any services I provide that could leverage, mostly it's chat-based systems, but things that are also value or summarization of data, analysis, like you can have helper tools. If you're in retail, you could ask your retail agent, hey, what happened to the order I made yesterday? Where is it? Can I return it? All these kind of services depend on private data. And companies should be thinking about how they can leverage that private data to create new services and add value. Because if they don't do it first, their competitors will.
Okay. If we're talking about private data, are we talking about data that has been generated by the end consumer or end customers, or are we talking about private data that has been generated maybe also within the company itself, where there might be, intellectual property and confidentiality going on?
Yeah.
So is there a difference
Yeah.
in your opinion?
There is, I think, because companies, if I'm a private company, right, let's say I'm a retail company, I have a lot of data related to orders at let's say it's an online retail company.
Mm-hmm.
People are making orders all the time, right? People are giving reviews on items. People are giving feedback. We're shipping goods. We know which goods are shipped late, which could turn up on time. All that data is not public data. It's in my databases. Now, if I want to give people a way of accessing my services that are enabled by large language models, I want them to be able to talk to me like a human and say, hey, I'm interested in ordering these shoes. When are they going to be available? And they say, oh, next week they're coming in. Then that's great. You're adding value to your services. That's private data, and the company owns it. Private individuals like myself, Facebook or Meta, recently said you have to pay €10 a month to use our services, or you can use them for free and give us all your data. And I think 99.99% of people said free, have my data. So I really think outside of Germany or the DACH world, the German-speaking world, most people don't care about their private data and they just give it away. They want the service and they don't have any long-term kind of vision. And we see that even with the most sensitive data, your DNA. I know a lot of people are getting their DNA sequenced because it's a bit cheaper here, but then the company owns all your DNA, but people are like, I don't care. So
Okay.
I think the horse has left the stable for consumer data. It's gone. But for enterprise data, it hasn't and it won't, because that's their competitive advantage. So I
Hmm.
think it's a very different story for enterprises with private data than consumers.
Okay. Out of curiosity, so you talked about DACH and that the DACH
Mm.
region, we German speaking people are very concerned with our data,
Yes.
and I think I would agree with you. How is it in Scandinavia? So Sweden, Finland.
I mean, I can give you examples of how you can look up my you can search for me today. You can find my phone number, my home address. You can press a button to send me flowers. You can get my birthday. We're very open in terms of we're a very open society in terms of data, and the it's a very different mentality. It's more akin. There's more trust in government. I think there's historical reasons for that and so on. And I don't need to get into it, but I can just say that people care about things being easy to use rather than their privacy first and foremost. And I think as an Anglo-Saxon, I think that's the same in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is very influential in the rest of the world.
Hmm.
That people just want things that are nice service, easy to use. Okay, got my private data, but I didn't pay for it. That's kind of a very common attitude. So um, I think you'll see the same with GPT. People love it, they're using it, and so on. They're not worried about what they're putting in there. They're putting in a lot of private information. OpenAI are keeping it all and going to use it, but I think that's just the way consumers are. It's hard to change that at this point. It needs education, which takes a long time.
Yeah. So ease of use is a very good bridge to my next question, Jim. Basically, nowadays everything is happening in real time. Both
Yeah.
businesses and consumers alike have pretty much grown used to it, and it has become a sign of quality and a benchmark. That businesses want to reach in order to show the quality. What needs to happen to make live data accessible, and maybe even more importantly, also processable for large language models?
Well, for large language models, yeah. I mean, I think so. For large language models, the thing about them to know is that they're trained on data as of a point of time, a cutoff time. After that, they know nothing. So they don't
Hmm.
know what has happened today. They don't know what happened last week. They don't know anything about my private data. So what we need to do is we need to integrate data. We need to have data available in real time, and to be able to when somebody wants to talk to a large language model, the data that we'll use to ask the question will have to come from our existing systems or maybe from the internet, from API calls. So this challenge is okay. I think the big challenge we have right now, this is what our company are working with specifically, is that, and I'll tell you what the community are doing, and then I'll tell you where I think the community are missing a bit.
Hmm.
So at the moment, the community are doing is if in large language models, we ask them a question. So maybe I'll ask it a question such as, I gave the retail example before. What happened to the shoes I ordered yesterday? Okay. Now, if I take that query, the community currently are saying we have a technology called a vector database, and the vector database should store lots of pieces of documents and strings, and then I should find the closest one to my question. Now, my question has nothing to do with a document or string. It's asking about the status of an order I made. Now, that would typically be stored in a database, and the database data is not in the vector database. So I can't ask and go to the vector database to get that data. It's not there. It's not going to be there. So what I need to do is I need to go from my natural language here to a database over here, and that's a challenge because one is we have like a structured way of querying the data from the database, and the other is natural language. We have to connect the two. That's something we're working on at the moment in our feature store. We have a couple of different ways of doing it. I won't get into the details of them, but like one of them, I can just throw out a buzzword for the very technically minded. There, we're looking at something called a two-tower embedding model to map those together. There's also fine tuning of large language models works as well. And these are some of the techniques we're doing to pull these two worlds together. And that really opens up the enterprise's data for the large language models so that you can ask a query and then it can find the relevant data in the existing data warehouses, databases, and so on, and use that then to help your large language model answer the question.
Hmm.
Because large language models are really good at that. Like, I could say, here's my last 10 orders for the last 10 days. And then you ask a question and say, well, how much did I spend over the last 10 days? It'll sum up those 10 orders and give you the answer.
Yeah.
They're quite good at doing these reasoning and even in this case arithmetic, so it can sum together. It's not very good at multiplication, but they can do sums.
Okay. All right. So, Jim, unfortunately, we're already approaching the end of this podcast episode. Therefore, tell our listeners, what are you go-to sources to keep yourself up to date on everything related to AI, blogs, TikTok, anything, and of course, also, as you are writing a book right now, right, on building or on how to build large language model systems, please also mention that again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Twitter, or X as it's called now. um, you know, but it is a great place where information is being shared on the latest developments in machine learning and AI. So there are a bunch of accounts I follow there, and I do get a lot of updates from there. I have an academic background. There are some conferences that are very good related to AI, ICML, and others. And in general, I find the community is moving very fast. So I'm writing a book. The book is on building machine learning systems for batch, real time, and large language models. But the book won't be finished until the end of the year. Now, the book is currently, you can get the first chapter available on O'Reilly. It's on O'Reilly's learning platform.
Hmm.
But the books tend to take a bit more time. So they're going to be more complete treatments of the work, and people will be able to understand the processes that they should follow to build systems and the state of the art. But at the moment, you'll find a lot of that information is spread out. You can find a lot of good blogs. There's some good newsletters you can follow. I like Paola Barta, who has a good newsletter on learning real-time machine learning. But I do think Twitter is probably the number one place where people share information. LinkedIn is popular, but it's not as technical. You'll get
Okay.
more non-technical work on LinkedIn, and the more technical folks tend to hang out on X.
Okay. So maybe, if possible, you could share those links with me after the podcast
Absolutely.
recording, and then I'll put those down in the description
Yeah,
of the
brilliant.
podcast episode. Awesome. Well, Jim, thanks for your precious time and knowledge that you shared with us. Have a great day, and yeah, talk to you soon.
All the best, Tommy. Thanks a million.